Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. We're here today to talk more about the SpaceX in-flight abort test, a part of NASA's Commercial Crew Program. The test is scheduled for tomorrow, Saturday, January 18th. Teams from NASA and SpaceX completed a launch readiness review yesterday, and to talk more about that review and the mission, I'm pleased to be joined by Program Manager of the Commercial Crew Program, Kathy Leaders, Benji Reed, Director of Crew Mission Management at SpaceX, and Mike McAleenan, Launch Weather Officer from the 45th Weather Squadron. We're going to begin today with opening questions from each of our speakers, and then we're going to turn it over to questions here from the audience. You can also ask a question using the phone bridge. Also, we have Ask NASA if you're following along on social media. And so we'll get to those questions after opening comments. And to kick us off, we'll start with Kathy.
So first of all, I really appreciate the great turnout. It's almost like launch day. But one of the first things I want to say is this isn't like launch day. What's different about it? Well, on launch day, we're really hoping for it not to be exciting. I will tell you tomorrow will be an exciting day. We are purposely failing a launch vehicle to make sure that our abort system on the spacecraft that will be flying for our crews works. And so that's a very, very different way for us to normally conduct a mission. So this is a very important test. Another thing that, unfortunately for the folks that will be standing around waiting for us to launch, it's not an instantaneous launch window. So, we'll be getting ready to do the test when it's the right time to do the test for all the logistics that needs to work to make sure that we're getting the test data, and then also to make sure we can recover the spacecraft and get the important information that's being captured on the spacecraft too. So you all may be waiting for a while we're trying to find the perfect time for us to be able to conduct this test. Third thing that's a little bit different is, our demonstration missions, and the DM-1 demonstration mission was under the TCAP contract. I don't know if people realize, but this is our last open milestone under our ICAP Space Act agreement. And because of that, this is an FAA licensed test launch. And so this has been a great practice session for us. Our next mission, the crewed mission, will be another NASA launch, but following that we'll be needing to do FAA licensed missions for our post-certification missions. And so this has been a really great learning experience for us to continue to work through all the things we need to continue to work through for our crew transportation missions coming up. Another great way we've been able to use the running up to this test is we were conducting a dry dress. Today we have been practicing how we would go and actually, with the launch vehicle on the day of a launch, a crewed launch, we'd bring our crews up and make sure the timing and everything works. And so you can see pictures from our dry dress test rehearsal today, where we had Bob and Doug, practicing what will soon be their steps that they'll be going through as they go and actually enter the Dragon spacecraft, and making sure that we are getting ready for that crewed launch. So in conclusion, this is a big test for us. This is a test of a system that's supposed to protect the crews, and we're very happy that SpaceX has taken a very challenging test platform to be able to do that. But it's a very important step in us making progress towards crewed transportation to the International Space Station. So thank you for being here.
And we'll go to Benji.
Great. Thank you for having me here. And it's always an honor, and it's truly a humbling experience getting to work on the Commercial Crew Program and being part of the effort to return American launch capability for astronauts. And the opportunity to work with NASA and all of our partners is always outstanding. As Kathy talked about, this test is very important to us. It's really the culmination of years of work together, of close partnership with NASA. We've been developing the crew transportation system, which really is a complete system. It's always an important thing to remember. It's the Falcon and the Dragon. It's the ground systems. It's the operators. It's all the hardware, all the software. It all goes into it together. And tomorrow's test is one of those things that's going to actually let us test that whole system end to end. And that's one of the things that's going to be exciting and a very good practice and a good thing that we need to go do. As I mentioned, this is the culmination of a lot of work and a lot of tests that brought us to today. Back in 2015, we did a pad abort test. This was a similar idea, right? The idea is that you've got the crew in the capsule. They're safely tucked in. They're in their seats. The capsule's closed, but something's gone wrong with the rocket or on the pad, and you want to be able to get them away quickly. And so we practiced that about 5 years ago in the Dragon capsule to make sure that the proof of concept of this launch escape system would work, and that worked very well. And now, fast forward here to tomorrow, the plan will be to basically do the same thing. Dragon is on top of the rocket. The rocket will take off. At about 84 seconds into launch, we'll trigger the launch escape system, and then Dragon will carry the astronauts safely away, carry the capsule tomorrow safely away from the Falcon. In the event that there were astronauts on board, that's the whole goal, and that's the main objective of this test, is to show that we can carry the astronauts safely away from the rocket in case anything's going wrong. I mentioned that we're triggering this test at about 84 seconds, and that's where we kind of hit the sweet spot of conditions that we think is the right place to test in. The reality is that there are many, many triggers and many different points in time where the launch escape system could initiate in order to keep the crew safe at any point in the whole trajectory. As we recall, there was not long ago, last year, there was an event on a Soyuz where they needed to use their launch or their escape system in ascent on the way to orbit. And so it really drives home the point of why we need to be able to have these systems. SpaceX originally proposed doing this test because we thought that it was important to do, and we still do, and it's one of the key steps that we get to before we go to our Demonstration 2 mission, which will carry Bob and Doug up to the space station. The road to getting here over the last many years has included many things, including that Demo 1 test. That was the first time an American vehicle has autonomously docked to the space station, and we brought the vehicle home safely. We've also done over 700 tests of our Super Draco engines. The Super Dracos are the engines that are embedded in Dragon. They're integral to the propulsion system of Dragon, and they're the things that are used for the launch escape. So tomorrow we get to see those Super Dracos fire again, just like we did 5 years ago at the pad abort, and again over 700 tests over the last number of years. And we also, this same Dragon is the one that we did a static fire test on in November. So that's where we held Dragon down and initiated those Super Dracos, basically simulating the test that we're going to do tomorrow, but in this case keeping Dragon held down to make sure that the Super Dracos and that system would work. Beyond that, there's been thousands of other tests of the propulsion system and many, many hundreds of tests of other subsystems on the vehicle, including our life support systems and others that are key overall to getting Bob and Doug to station and bringing them home safely, and proving this system out and certifying this system to become an operational transportation system for astronauts and for the International Space Station. At this point, I think we should go to the slide. As I mentioned, as we talked about already, the launch window opens up tomorrow at 8 a.m., and it's about a 4-hour launch window. This is a test, and as Kathy mentioned, it's not an instantaneous window, so things could happen a lot of point in times in that window. We decide when we decide to go. In fact, we're already looking at possibly extending the launch window just to maximize flexibility of opportunity. A little bit about the weather, and we'll get an actual weather briefing here, but to understand some of the constraints and how these always play together is important. It's really an integrated problem when you look at the weather in this situation, right? It's not just about the launch and the ascent of the launch vehicle, but in this case, we also need to consider what the weather's doing for the abort. We want to make sure that we're going to be able to safely abort and also safely recover the vehicle when we get to the ocean. So we have to look at things like wave height and wind speeds as well for those purposes. One of the things I want to mention is if you look at the slide in the bottom part of it, it mentions that that this Falcon has flown many times, and this is kind of exciting. And I don't know, Kathy, if you knew this or not, but the Falcon that's flying tomorrow has flown 3 times before. Tomorrow will be its 4th flight, and this is the first Falcon Block 5. So Block 5 Falcon was the major upgrade to Falcon that we did in order to carry crew and to become human spaceflight rated. And this is the first vehicle that flew in the Block 5 configuration. And it's going to refly tomorrow for this test for the Commercial Crew Program. And as another interesting point, our launch that we're planning later this week for Starlink is actually going to fly the same Falcon that flew Demo 1 as well. So have some fun little trivia there, too. We'll go to the next slide.
It's a good vehicle.
It's a good vehicle. Kathy already talked about this, and I think it's super important to understand and the value of this test is not just in doing the launch abort or the launch escape system test, right? There's a huge amount of work that goes into this. One of the things you want to do, and as I mentioned, this is a whole system, and part of that system are all the people who are operating, whether it's the astronauts like Bob and Doug, as you see on the screen, or all of the hundreds of people who are working at NASA and at SpaceX to operate the vehicles and ensure safety. And so we want to practice. We want to test like we fly, and we want to practice like we fly. And the great thing about doing this test, aside from the main objective of proving out the launch escape system, is we get to do all of that. So in the lead up to this, we did that dry dress today. That went very well. And it's not just that the crew gets suited up and goes out to the pad, goes up the tower, they walk all the way out to the Dragon. We got to time that. We actually ran it without any stops. We wanted to make sure that the timing that we've been practicing for the last many months is accurate, and it was. We learned some lessons. We take some notes. We apply them to make sure that launch day with crew will work very well. But we also get to have all of the operators on console. So the operators went on console early this morning. Some folks were there at 1 a.m., starting up the whole process of getting ready to go. And they get to practice that whole process of what it's going to be like to have the crew board Dragon. And then tomorrow is the same idea. Not only is this a test of the launch escape system, but everybody gets to practice the process of launching crew. On that note, we will be loading the Falcon the same way, loading the propellant on Falcon the same way that we will load on the crew missions. We've actually done that a number of times on previous flights. We'll continue that process of doing crew loading on the crew configuration loading on Falcon. And just to kind of reiterate what that looks like, right? So ultimately, the crew goes up into, like I mentioned, they go off the tower, they go into the crew arm, they get into Dragon, they get into their seats, they get all plugged in. We shut the hatch. They're safe and sound. About 2 minutes before we start propellant loading on Falcon, we arm the launch escape system. And this is a key point, right? So the crew is in there. They're safe and sound. We arm the launch escape system. And then we start propellant loading on Falcon. Propellant loading takes about 30 minutes, and then we launch. And the idea here is that we're minimizing exposure to crew, both the astronauts and also the ground crew and everybody who's supporting them, to the actual process of having propellants loaded on the rocket and during that propellant loading time. We're going to practice that again tomorrow. Overall, for the test timeline, we're again test like you fly. Everything else will go just about as we would expect to on launch day with crew. We'll go ahead and go to the next slide and see an animation. I think is what's next. Great. So this is an animation of what we expect it to look like tomorrow. So we'll take off and launch the rocket about 84 seconds in. At about 19 kilometers out and about 20 kilometers high. About 4 kilometers out and about 19 kilometers high. We'll initiate the launch escape system. Dragon will leave the Falcon very quickly. It will then hit an apogee of about 40 kilometers high. It'll jettison the trunk, It'll reorient itself with the Draco engines, and then it'll continue its trajectory down. And about 5 minutes after launch, the parachutes will deploy. And about 10 minutes after launch, we expect splashdown. Splashdown will occur probably around 30, 35 kilometers off of shore. Depends a little bit on winds. That's really it. You know, again, it's an honor, and it's always a humbling experience, as I mentioned, to do this, to be part of this, to work with the crew. Getting to sit with them this morning and their debrief after the dry dress is very important to all of us to understand that we're really getting ready to go, getting ready to fly. And I want to thank again, of course, NASA and the Commercial Crew Program, Kennedy Space Center, the 45th Space Wing, the FAA, and all of the different agencies and groups that we get to work with all the time to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Benji. And Mike.
All right, well, I'm sorry to say yesterday was probably the last 80-degree winter day we're going to have for a while. The upper-level ridge we had in place has kind of broken down last night. If you were up at midnight helping the crew, we saw a little front go through, a little bit of rain showers, and that just indicates that that ridge has really broke down. If we go to the satellite, you can see that next frontal system ginning up in Texas. That's a couple days out, but that's what's going to bring winter into Florida finally. We got some pretty gusty winds behind that front that you can see draped over the Bahamas and southern Florida, and that's what's causing some gusty winds out there right now. It's also going to generate some higher waves. That's going to slowly diminish tomorrow, but early on, that's really the main concern. If we go to the launch forecast, okay, so this is typical launch forecast, 10% chance. You think that's great, right? Man, that's hardly anything of a violation. But that is only for the launch portion. There's a lot of things that have to come together for recovery. That's not included in the launch forecast. You mentioned waves and winds. I want to take some pictures and make sure everything happens. So that's cloud cover. So we're trying to find a time that has launch weather lining up with recovery weather. And tomorrow, it gradually improves on the recovery weather through the day. So you might be sitting around for a while waiting for that wind and waves to die down a little bit over the water. But it will gradually come down. Go to the next slide, 24-hour. I can tell you that recovery weather is great. Very light winds and very low waves. Unfortunately, that front is moving into the panhandle of Florida, and we're going to see a lot of upper-level clouds moving into our areas. You can see that's not good for optics, and it's not too good for launch weather. So through the 4-hour window, you're going to see the probability of violation for launch weather increase from 50 to 60%. So later in the window is bad if we go to Sunday. Later in the window is good for all those things coming together for Saturday. Now if we go to the 48-hour delay, recovery weather is starting to look okay in the morning, but it gets worse in the afternoon as the winds pick up, which is when the launch weather gets a little better. Okay, so we got the front moving out, so the clouds are going to dissipate through the countdown or through the launch window, and we're looking better towards the end of the window than the beginning, but that's the opposite of what's happening out over the water. So it's a nice dance between launch weather, optics, winds, and waves offshore. So we're trying to find a time where all those things match up, and we don't have the perfect day just yet, but we'll find it, and we'll make sure we only go when it's ready and everything is lining up. Thanks.
And thank you, Mike. And we'll now turn it over to questions. We'll start with those in the room. We also have people following along on social media, so you can use the hashtag AskNASA. And we also have a phone bridge. For now, since we have a lot of questions, we'll stick it to one per reporter, and then if we can get back around, so please state your name and affiliation as we go around as well. That'd be great. And we'll start at the front of the room with Marcia.
Hello, Marcia Dunn, Associated Press for Benji. How close is this dragon to the real deal? And will Ripley or another mannequin be along for the ride?
That's a great question. This is a Crew Dragon, and so we've built it and developed it just like we would a full crew vehicle that we'd fly crew on. The only difference is it doesn't include all of the components or systems that you don't need in there. Like we haven't fully built out the interior. for example, right? But it has all of the equipment that you need in there. And yes, there are other anthropomorphic test devices, as we call them, basically that are human-shaped and human mass that sit in the seats. And we've got 2 of them in there with sensors in the seats to make sure that we really do understand the forces that are going on. It's important to remember that this is specifically a system designed to keep people safe and bring them home safely and have some sense of what they're going to be going through and the comforts that they're going to be seeing. We expect them to feel no more than about 4 Gs of force
when they go through the launch abort.
Bill Horowitz, CBS News for Benji. Can you walk us through maybe a little finer detail on when the abort gets triggered? Do the Falcon 9's first of all, is it computer commanded or is it ground commanded? Do the engines shut down on the Falcon 9 before the abort takes place or after? And when you lose propulsion on the first stage, I'm assuming the vehicle aerodynamically comes apart. So I was wondering if you expect fuel mixing, flame in the sky, and finally, I realize this is all one question, right? Is the second stage, is that fully fueled? Is there an engine in the second stage, or what's its configuration? Thanks.
That's great, and you've set me up for all of the good answers. So it was really good. It's a really great question. How does it go through? So the triggers are set. It's about 84 seconds. We've preset this trigger intentionally because, again, we kind of want to hit the sweet spot of where we think we get the most effective data out of this test. What'll happen basically is we'll launch abort, we'll initiate the launch escape, and the Falcon engines will shut down. So the thrust on the Falcon will shut down right after that happens. When that happens, Dragon at the same time will be getting away. It takes about 10 seconds for Super Draco burn on the Dragon. Dragon will hit about 2.3 Mach 2.3 as it's getting away. We expect it to be actually quite far away from Falcon at the speed at the acceleration that it's going before anything starts to happen on Falcon. But that's a fairly quick process. So fairly quickly as well, Falcon will be going through a lot of aerodynamic issues. Basically, the Dragon will have left, so the top end of the second stage is now basically a big air scoop. Right, and so you've got all this air pushing against it, a huge amount of force pushing against it. It's also cut thrust, so it's no longer pushing up in a trajectory. It's going to be a lot more susceptible to the winds and starting to fall as it loses its velocity and start to tumble. At some point, we expect then that the Falcon will start to break up. And yes, both stages are loaded with fuel because we want to have the right mass and do all the tests the right way. So with those both stages loaded with fuel, we do expect there'll probably be some amount of ignition, flame. We'll see something on a clear day, possibly from the ground you could see it. But we do expect it to break up. Our Falcon 9 recovery forces will be standing by, ready to go and recover as much of the Falcon as we can and safely as possible. The key thing, though, to think about is while that's going on, and that'll be the exciting part of the day that Kathy mentioned, that we don't want to have that kind of excitement normally, Dragon will also be doing its thing. And that's what we'll be particularly focused on, is getting Dragon over through apogee, trunk jettison, and then on to parachute deploy and recovery. And the Dragon recovery forces will also be out there. One thing I didn't mention earlier, and I think it's a good point, is that when Dragon splashes down, we'll be approaching the vehicle within a few minutes. But the Detachment 3, Det 3, which is part of the Air Force, who is on call for emergency recovery for the vehicle. Our recovery team will recover the astronauts and Dragon when in a normal recovery situation when they're coming home from space station. But any kind of a contingency recovery event, for example, in a launch escape situation, Det 3 will go out with their parajumpers and will actually go and recover the capsule for us. So they're going to be with us tomorrow. They're going to be practicing. It's another great example of the kind of practice and testing that we get. So we're going to practice with them, and they'll spend about an hour doing practice and with our team and around the vehicle as part of the recovery tomorrow. There is not a second stage engine. That's right.
Thanks. Irene Klotz with Aviation Week for Benji. One quick follow-on with Bill's list. Does the automated flight termination system have any role in what's going to be happening tomorrow? And then I was curious, this flight originally was going to be 9 months ago, and obviously there was a need to prepare a second vehicle, but was there anything else that drove the 9-month schedule slip? Thanks.
Sure. That's a good question. So in terms of, I'll answer the first part of the question. Repeat that one for me. Automated flight, yeah. So the FTS, the Automated Flight Termination System. For the FTS, that will be armed. Of course, we're launching a rocket, and we want to make sure that that we're going to keep the public safe as well as part of what the FTS is there for, and that will be armed. But we don't expect it to have to be triggered at all. And in the event, there's an interesting point too. As a test, we do have the launch escape system armed. And so if something else were to go wrong that we weren't planning at 84 seconds, Dragon will still launch escape beforehand, and we'll still be able to see that the launch escape system performed. And the FTAs would, if it had to be used, it would be used after that. In terms of the schedule, the biggest change was, of course, we had the anomaly when we did our Dragon static fire in the spring, and so we needed to go back and absolutely, number one, understand what happened in that anomaly, and understand everything there and make sure that we had mitigated it and implemented all of those changes, which we've done. That anomaly report is complete, and we've actually filed that with all the various agencies, and so that's good to go. Really, the schedule was about doing that, going through the investigation process, filing the investigation report, getting that completed, and then also taking the vehicle, kind of moving ahead in our vehicle build flow. Because what we had is we always have a number of Dragons in build at any given point in time. And so we just moved ahead one. The Dragon that we had originally planned to fly on Demo 2, we moved into the in-flight abort. The one that we had originally planned for our first operational mission is now the Demo 2 vehicle. So we just moved them ahead of flow. But of course, that takes some time to get those built out.
Hi, I'm Jim Siegel. I'm with NASA Tech. And by the way, thank you for that animation earlier. That was very helpful, I thought. I have a question about the criteria down in the landing site. So what are the criteria that you're going to be using, like wave height and temperature and wind? And are there other criteria besides that you'll be looking at tomorrow?
It's a combination of all of those, and I don't know the thresholds off the top of my head for the specifics in terms of the weather, but it is particularly, you're looking at cloud cover for sure. We want to make sure that we have enough visibility. The point of this test is to gather as much data as we can, and so we're actually going to have a number of assets, ground and air-based assets, gathering video of this, and we want to make sure that they have clear sight as well. And then there is waves, and you want to understand, wave height and just ground wind speed as well as wind speed as you're moving up through the trajectory.
Lauren Gresh at The Verge. Adding on to that, so in the future, let's say, unfortunately, a launch abort has to happen, what is the most extreme kind of conditions that the Crew Dragon could land in? I know you guys want good conditions for this test, but what wave heights could you handle, and would that be a factor in when you launch in the future?
That's a really good question, and it's kind of question you should be helping develop our launch commit criteria, because it's a great question that we ask ourselves, right? Is what kind of weather, what are all the conditions that allow us to launch, and as we look at launching crews, we take that very seriously and look at it very extensively, and so in the case of an actual crew flight, we're not only looking at the nominal trajectory, we are also looking at the launch path in terms of aborts. So we actually want, before we would launch the crew, we would want to understand the path and where they might land in an abort case. So we actually look at that weather as well.
Just to add on, so that means that there will be a lot of other weather factors that could delay launches in the future.
Absolutely. The number one most important thing is that we launch them safely, get them to station safely.
We'll take one question from here in the room, and then we'll go to the phone bridge.
Chris Gephardt with NASA Spaceflight. I wanted to go back to the AFTS. So it'll be armed, it'll be functional, but you don't expect it to blow the Falcon 9 even though you're triggering an off-nominal mode with it. Am I understanding that right? And can you talk about why it won't trigger? Because I thought that was the whole point of having it there. So if something like that happened, it would blow the rocket.
That's a great question. And that's correct. We don't expect it to blow up the rocket, and that's by design. So because what we're doing is we're cutting thrust. We're doing what we call thrust termination. So as soon as Dragon leaves the launch vehicle, we go into thrust termination. Falcon just stops. And so then we've done all of the analyses and understanding what could happen to it, what we think where would it fall to if it's going to break apart, where do the pieces go. We do that. We work with all the agencies because, again, public safety is also very important. We want to make sure that it's, going to fall down in the right places. And so we've assessed that deeply and know that we can do this with thrust termination. We don't need to use FTS.
So is that standard for all crew missions? If you had a failure on the booster that was a thrust termination event, it wouldn't trigger the AFTS, or is this just specific to this test?
My understanding is that we're flying we're testing like we fly. So I believe that, yes, we want to make sure that the most important thing, again, is that the launch escape system works and that we're getting the crew away from Falcon as quickly as possible. And then as important is also the public safety. So we will always assess what's going to happen with Falcon after a launch escape and make sure that we're making the right choices in terms of what happens next.
And now we'll go to the phone bridge. First up, we have Dave Mosier from Business Insider.
Thank you for taking my question. I really appreciate it. So I want to circle back to this particular failure mode that you're testing. This is one of many modes, as you said. I'd like to hear more about the explanation or why this particular profile was chosen. Was it the hardest? Is it going to give you the most data? Maybe a bit of both? And then also about the data collection, which you mentioned, are there plans to sort of deeply record the Falcon breakup? Thank you.
Okay, I think I heard the last part as well. There's a lot of different triggers that we look at. There's location trigger, GPS. There's understanding velocity and accelerations on the vehicle as it's ascending. There's understanding just the different forces at work. We're looking for anything that's off nominal. Right? There's actually many different parameters that we're looking at and we're assessing. Those launch escape triggers have actually been under assessment for many years, and working closely with NASA and actually other government agencies to understand what all could happen and make sure that we would escape at the right point in time. So I can't really give you a specific list of what they all are, but there's many of them, and it has to do with anything that's off nominal about the behavior of Falcon. And then we set the parameters for many different metrics and set the thresholds for launch escape. And certainly we will also be looking at Falcon. The primary objective is Dragon, but we'll also be paying attention to what Falcon's doing tomorrow.
We picked this test condition. I mean, we went through and jointly assessed, what we thought would be kind of the best test for us to do as a joint team, right? And picked that particular time frame because it was a stressing test for us. It's a very it's an area where we could collect a lot of data on the overall systems, and those are all part of the kind of the factors that we weighed together to determine this particular test case.
And now on the phone, we have Robert Perlman from Collect Space.
Hey, thank you. What is to become of this Dragon after this flight? If it's recovered successfully, is it being refurbished for future use or being retired? And is there any interesting or commemorative items on board acting as ballast?
Asking Benji to reveal all his secrets.
I'll tell you all of my secrets. The Dragon, as I mentioned, it's a full crew Dragon, and our expectation is to be able to recover it well, and we'll assess what it looks like afterward. There are a lot of forces in going through a launch escape. We want to make sure that Dragon, if it was something we could refurbish and use again, we would look at that certainly, but we'll need to assess that afterward. And in terms of any goodies that are hidden in Dragon, everybody always wants to do that, but I think we make an effort to focus on the test and make sure that we've loaded the Dragon with the sensors that we need to get the data that we need. That's the real treasure.
We're going to take two more phone questions and come back in the room. We have next up Eric Berger from Ars Technica.
Hi,
Hi, good afternoon. My question is for Kathy. Can you talk about what happens after this test, Kathy? Are there additional parachute tests or things like that, or is it kind of now paperwork and analysis and sort of making sure that everything, all the data you get, kind of sets them up for a crew mission? Maybe just walk me through the timeline now.
I'll get started, and Benji can fill in if I miss anything. I mean, I think the big activities, obviously, this is a big activity for us to get through this test. This is a validation test, so obviously, your launch escape system has to cover all kinds of scenarios, and so this test is just one to make sure that all of our models and everything else, all the data that's anchored to all those tests that Benji talked about before is operates the way we were expecting it to operate. So going through, getting this test done, us both, going through the data, making sure there's not any surprises is obviously a big milestone for us, Eric. We do have some more chute tests to do, system level tests. I think so far the upgraded system that the SpaceX folks have been developing has been operating very well. And actually, the upgraded chutes are on the in-flight abort test too. So this is another, we keep talking about all the great things on this test, but us getting another system level test on the in-flight abort test is another great test for us. We are still working through paperwork and everything else, but as we say, it's not just paperwork, it's really all making sure the teams have reviewed all the data from all the work that the SpaceX guys have been doing, along with work that the NASA team's been doing to make sure that, we're in sync on where the systems are and certification of the system. We are really human certifying these Dragon spacecraft and Falcon 9. And so us stepping through that together and making sure that we've dotted all the I's and crossed the T's before our crewed demonstration flight is very, very important. So we've got work to do, but honestly, getting this test behind us is a huge milestone.
And now we'll go to Tim Fernholz with Quartz.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to do this. Just a quick follow-on about the test profile. How fast will the vehicle be going when the launch escape system is triggered? And what kind of analysis do you do to compare that to when it may be triggered later in flight? We mentioned the Soyuz case. That happened, I think, a lot later in the flight profile. So how do you know it will work going much faster at a higher altitude? Thank you.
I'll admit I didn't completely follow that. I think I heard how fast the vehicle will be going when we initiate launch escape. It'll be a little past max Q. Max Q, I think, is at about 1.8 Mach. And so a little faster than that. But I don't know the exact speed at which we're going. I know that it's about 84 seconds in. But I may have missed the other part of the question.
I think it's how do you know? Obviously, we talked about this is just one test point. This is a test at a particular time for the launch escape system. Really the escape system, what we call our, having the abort capability is really available all the way up until we get to station. And so we go collect all that data from all those tests that Benji is talking about, and you put it into our Monte Carlos and make sure that that we are verifying that the crew will be safe if we're executing abort all along that trajectory, right? And so this is just one data point. We say this test is very, very important because it really shows that the systems work together at this particular data point, and it's a very strenuous data point for us. But there's all those system level tests, those ground level tests, and all of that Monte Carlo and GNC work that we do is really what then really certifies our abort capabilities. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I think that's exactly right. I think probably one of the most important things we're getting out of this test is the interaction between the vehicles, right? Until Dragon is, deployed safely away from Falcon in orbit, it really is like a single vehicle, right? These two vehicles are talking together. The flight computers are fully integrated. We develop them that way. The people that work on them, are often cross over and work together on them. We test them on the test tables. We have the full inner workings of Dragon and Falcon, as all the electronics boxes and the software is all run on many times, 24 hours a day at our facility, running different scenarios, making sure that these vehicles will always work well together. But there's nothing like actually doing a flight test in environmental forces to see what's going to happen. And so that's one of the key things that we want to get out of this.
We're from the Washington Post. Hey, Benji. A question about the fate of your beloved thrice flown booster. You said it could tumble, it might come apart. You mentioned a fire. I mean, is there a possibility that it could actually explode if people are watching, from the beach? Should they be prepared for that? And then also, because you usually recover your vehicles and don't ditch them, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about any mitigation you're doing in terms of environmental impacts. Thanks.
Sure. Absolutely, Chris. So, again, the second stage will be loaded with propellant. There'll still be quite a bit of propellant in the first stage. We expect there to be some sort of ignition and probably a fireball of some kind. Whether I would call it an explosion that you would see from the ground, I don't know. We'll have to see what actually happens. But I wouldn't be surprised, and that wouldn't be a bad outcome if that's what we saw. In terms of the debris, absolutely, one of the key things that we're always looking at is working with the right agencies and the right groups to make sure that we're protecting the environment, we're protecting the public, and we're doing the right things. So we've assessed all of that. We've assessed what we think the maximum possible debris field is. And again, our teams will be standing by ready to go recover as much as we can safely possible and basically make sure that the environment is safe.
Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut. For Kathy and Benji, can you run me through speaking of hypergolic fluids, when is it actually prepared on the vehicle and loaded up on the vehicle? At what point in the procedure is it actually armed? I guess you said it armed at, T-minus 2 minutes before fuel up, but when is the actual hypergolic loaded up on the Dragon? And on recovery, how does the recovery crew and potentially astronauts, how do they know the environment's safe from hypergolic propellant?
Do you want to?
Well, Dragon's loaded about a week out, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So Dragon's usually loaded about a week out, right? And obviously then transported over to the hangar, right? So there's a Dragon land, right? Go ahead. Go ahead.
So no, usually at about L-2 weeks is when we decide that it's good to go load it, and like Kathy said, so roughly in that time frame, kind of in the week before, after we've made all the decisions to go at about L-2 weeks on a mission, then we're going to go and load Dragon with the propellant. So that's already been done, and we do that in the Dragon processing facility, and then we transport it over to be integrated with Falcon. All the while that you're loading hypergolic propellants, all the time that you're dealing with a loaded vehicle, you're going to a large set of safety protocols that people take very seriously, and you also have a lot of these detectors that allow you to detect the hypergolic propellants. And so all through the processing process and the pre-launch process, we do that. The same thing on recovery. We want to make sure it's a really good question. You do care about that. You want to make sure the crew is safe. They've gotten all the way to the water. You want to make sure they're not going to have some exposure that isn't good. And so the same thing. We've got sensors and detectors and a lot of process and a huge amount of analysis and ground testing, mechanical ground testing, to show that the structures are able to take the forces and contain anything and that you wouldn't have a problem.
And this is a huge practice session for us, right? So that's why the recovery crew's out there. There's NASA folks on the recovery boat too. We're all following along to make sure that we're understanding how we would work together to go follow through the procedures, make sure the procedures are checked out before we go get ready to go fly crew.
One of the cool things is the crew actually gets to, do that kind of practice where we practice recovery. They go out. We have a practice Dragon that we put in the water and we take them out, and they've practiced, and other people have run through the processes and steps too.
We have time for just a few more questions, so we're going to try to get as many as we can in the room, and we'll go back to here.
Hi, Ken Chang, New York Times. This is a question for Kathy. You spoke about how important it is to have an in-flight abort. Boeing is not doing that with the Starliner, and so you won't have the data point of the interaction of the Starliner with Atlas V. I was wondering if you could just talk about the tests and analysis that you've done so you have the same level of confidence in that spacecraft?
So I think the one thing about Commercial Crew Program is we are allowing each of the providers to kind of propose their testing and verification closeouts in the way that best helps them. I think the SpaceX folks have proposed their strategies for closing out the requirements. That includes this particular in-flight abort test. The Boeing guys proposed a different way. There's advantages for having the pad abort test and being able to anchor your models and your systems in different ways. And so the good thing is each of them have their pros, lots of pros. And so we, as long as it's meeting our overall strategy, we allow the flexibility for each of the providers to be able to propose what makes sense for their system.
Hi, Stephen Clark from Spaceflight Now. For Benji, can you update us on where the Demo 2 vehicle stands in processing right now? Has it left the factory in Hawthorne? I understood there was maybe a thermal vacuum test or something going on with it. Can you update us if is that done and when it could be delivered to the Cape and maybe the earliest it could be ready to launch with Bob and Doug?
Sure, absolutely. It's coming along very well. In fact, we just recently completed the heat shield mate, where we attached the heat shield to the spacecraft, and we're on track for completing the vehicle and delivering it around the end of this month from Hawthorne down to the Cape. And there's a number of checkouts and tests that we do as we go through that process.
And we're going to go to Joey Roulette with Reuters.
Thanks. With SpaceX having already conducted a pad abort test and static fires, can you tell me what data you get out of this in-flight abort, going through the stresses of the atmosphere and on the rocket that you wouldn't normally get in simulations? And then for Benji, you said the anomaly report is complete. Can you kind of give a summary of what new hardware is on this Crew Dragon that wasn't on it before the anomaly happened? Thanks.
Hey, everybody likes tests. The more things, the thing that's I think really great about SpaceX is they have a lot of hardware to test, right? And so I don't think NASA ever doesn't do a test that a provider, proposes to them. And I think what's been great about this is SpaceX folks, it's in their philosophy to continue to test. I think that's where they gain their confidence. I think when they proposed this, as we said, they proposed this really under ICAP, which, as folks know, that's many, many years ago. And it was, a big where they thought that they had a lot of experience based on cargo, on launch and entry of spacecraft. But this one area that they hadn't really been able to kind of expand on their capability was with a launch with escape systems, right? And so it was their unique, it's kind of what we talked about before, with their unique capability and what was right for them, they, under the ICAP Space Act agreement, had said, hey, we would like to use your investment to expand that capability, right? We're very happy. I think our teams love it that we get to use this as a way for us to, be able to practice and work towards our crewed mission. There had been some debate within NASA and SpaceX about, do we want to close out the SAA early, do this test 2 years ago? And we said, no, let's do this when it's the right time, and look at it, especially after they ended up winning one of the TCAP awards. They came in and said, you know what, we would really like to have this in-flight abort test when we're farther along in the system. So I think Benji and I have now been like on our 34th or 35th quarterly review on my Space Act agreement, because we've really just been waiting and holding and having this Space Act agreement milestone when it was the right time for them to conduct it.
We have time for two more questions. We're going to go to Ken Kramer, and then we'll go to Emery Kelly.
Hi, Ken Kramer. Thanks for Space Up Close and Rocket STEM. Thank you for doing this, and hopefully everything goes great tomorrow. My question is about the Super Draco engines, Kathy and Benji. Why are you confident that these engines will work now and they will not blow up in light of the anomaly. What changes did you require? What tests did you require that SpaceX carry out to prove it's not going to blow up, because astronauts' lives are at stake and the space station is potentially at stake too? Thanks.
So, I mean, I think a big test was a static fire, right? But along with that, we've done, and Benji could talk about this more, we've done tons of system level tests with the Super Dracos themselves. And then we've done lots of tests to really understand how the system operates from a fluids perspective, which was data that we learned out of the anomaly investigation. We've learned a ton out of this anomaly investigation. And so I think the great thing about it is that team has been able to, our teams, both NASA and SpaceX, have been able to work in parallel with the anomaly investigation team. And as the team was learning new data, be able to roll this into upgrades to the design and also roll it into our understanding of how these, high flow prop systems work in this area. So I think we're light years ahead in understanding how these particular systems operate right now. And really, this test is another important step in us clearing the system for a crewed flight. I don't know if you want to add anything, Benji.
No, I think the most important thing is that we took the time to do the investigation, that we did it right. We did it in close partnership. I mean, NASA and other groups were part of our investigation team and board. And some of the changes that we've made, I think are really critical to the system. And part of the investigations, we learned things that nobody knew in the industry before. And we've been sharing that information. We plan to share a lot more of that information with the industry. And we've implemented changes due to that information.
Yeah, we've learned. We've all learned. NASA's learned, SpaceX has learned. This is data that will be important for anybody out there to have to be able to build safer systems.
So it's not going to happen again.
We are doing everything we can to make it not happen again.
Test.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hey, Emery Kelly with Florida Today. I just want to pivot to the other crews out in the ocean while this is happening. How long before you give them a break? 3 attempts, 4 attempts? When do you kind of bring them back in and then try again? What's the balance there?
That's a great question. Yeah. It is really important to always talk about all the crews working on a launch, right? And the ground team and the recovery teams on boats and everybody everywhere, including just the operators sitting on consoles. We have to watch their sleep and make sure they're getting enough sleep. So we have strict rules about how long people can be on shift. And how long and what they need to be, including at work. Like there's on shift, but then they're still kind of working, and no, you can't do that. You need to go home and get some sleep, go back to your hotel, get some sleep. The same applies on the boats, and so people are out. They have accommodations, though, on the boats as well. So often once the fleet goes out, within a certain set of opportunities, they'll stay out, but they have the accommodations they need and the training they need to stay out there. But they still have to follow shift rules and make sure that folks are getting enough rest.
I heard the cook is really good, so that's always a selling point.
Well, that's going to wrap it up for us here. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for the briefing on SpaceX in-flight abort test. We'll have live coverage starting about 15 minutes prior to the test, so you can follow us on social media or online for updates about the launch time, which right now we're targeting the broadcast to begin at 7:45 a.m. for an 8 a.m. launch. Thank you very much, and have a good day.